Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Today I want to share with you one of the strangest, boldest and most controversial fan theories about the Harry Potter universe. A theory that's hard to believe, and all the more intriguing because of it. What if Harry Potter's real father wasn't James Potter, but Severus Snape? If you look closely, Harry and Severus are connected by something much deeper than appearances. On the outside, he may resemble James, but in soul and spirit, he might be far closer to the man he once believed to be his greatest enemy. Today, we'll walk through the core arguments of this theory, and who knows, maybe by the end, you'll see the Harry Potter saga in a very different light. Enjoy the video. Number 1. James Potter, a reflection of Draco Malfoy. When Harry first arrived at Hogwarts, a sleek, confident boy named Malfoy approached him and offered his friendship, but beneath the politeness lay a sense of superiority. The moment Harry declined, Malfoy became a sworn enemy. And then in Snape's memories, we witnessed something startling. James Potter was almost a carbon copy of Draco, a rich boy from a respected family, proud of his status and house, looking down on anyone who didn't belong to his circle. He despised Snape from the start, simply for being in Slytherin. He mocked, humiliated, and belittled him. James was the poster child of the wizarding world's golden youth. The Potters were wealthy and respected. Severus came from poverty and a broken home, and like Draco, James looked at him with arrogant pity, bordering on hatred. Number 2. Harry and Severus were saved by Lily's love. Both Harry and Severus grew up in isolation and rejection. Harry in a cupboard under the stairs, Severus under his father's fists, surrounded by poverty. Their hearts were wounded from the start. But then came Lily. For Harry, she was the mother who gave her life for him. For Severus, the only light in his darkness. She became the one friend he'd never known before. And though he lost her, choosing the wrong path, making a tragic mistake, his love never faded. When Lily died, Snape fell to his knees before Dumbledore. He didn't beg forgiveness, he begged protection for the child of the woman he loved, and he kept serving that love all his life, because Lily was the anchor that saved Harry, both literally and symbolically. And perhaps she saved Severus's soul too. Number 3. Harry and Snape, children of pain, not privilege. In the Deathly Hallows, Harry sees Snape's memories. He sees that first meeting with Lily. Severus, thin, brooding, in ragged clothes. James, polished, confident, adored by all. Compare that with Harry's own childhood. Hand-me-downs, no love, constant belittlement, an outsider. And in that moment, seeing young Snape, Harry understood. This wasn't just a cold, bitter professor. This was a mirror. James had never known suffering. He never knew what it meant to be cast aside, but Harry did, and deep down he sensed it. Snape was closer to him than James ever was. He came from the same world. Number 4. Why didn't Snape suspect anything? Paradoxically, despite the many similarities, Snape never once stopped to wonder, what if? Perhaps the hatred for James was too deeply rooted. He saw in Harry the son of his tormentor, and hated him on sight. James's hair, James's glasses, James's arrogance. But what he didn't see was that Harry wasn't like James. Harry wasn't arrogant. He didn't mock the weak. He never felt superior. On the contrary, he defended others. He doubted, he suffered, just like Snape once did. Still, Snape seethed. Because in Harry he saw more than just James. He saw the echo of his own failures, that he hadn't protected Lily, that he hadn't been there, that he could have been Harry's father, but wasn't. Number 5. Snape and Harry, reluctant heroes. Snape never wanted to be a hero. He wanted one thing, Lily. But when she died, everything changed. He didn't ask to spy. He didn't crave danger. Yet he stood between two worlds for nearly 20 years, lying to everyone, including himself. I have spied for you, lied for you, put myself in mortal danger for you, he told Dumbledore, voice shaking not from fear, but exhaustion. His heroism was never clean, never noble in the way people admired. It was cold, brutal, necessary. He saved lives from the shadows and never let anyone see the cost. Harry didn't ask to be chosen either. He never wanted fame or prophecy. He just wanted a family. But when Voldemort returned, Harry stood up, not because he was brave, but because no one else could. He broke rules, fought monsters, faced death again and again, not for glory, for others. His heroism was raw, flawed, human. Like Snape, he wore masks, anger, sarcasm, distance. "I don't want anyone else to try to help," he once said, because deep down he knew this path was his alone. Both men fought because they had no choice, and that's what made their courage so rare, so real. Number 6, the power of sacrifice. Lived, not just died. James died a hero. He faced Voldemort without a wand in his hand, buying Lily and Harry a few more seconds. It was brave, but it was quick. A single act of defiance. Harry and Snape lived their sacrifice every day. Harry gave up childhood the moment Hagrid said, "You're a wizard." From that point on, he belonged to a war. He missed birthdays, peace, normalcy. Every year brought danger. Every year he chose others over himself. "I'm going to die," he told Neville in the final battle, and he meant it. No glory, no spotlight, just the quiet decision to walk into death because the world needed saving. Snape's sacrifice burned slower. He gave up everything for a boy he claimed to hate. He let the world despise him, let the students fear him, let the Death Eaters trust him. He watched Dumbledore die by his own wand. He carried out plans he hated, in silence, for a future he might never see. "You have kept him alive so that he can die at the proper moment," Dumbledore said. And Snape didn't flinch. He had made his choice long ago. Love didn't save him, duty didn't reward him, but he kept going, one day at a time, until the very end. Number 7, deep attachment to loneliness. Harry had friends, but he never stopped feeling alone. Ron and Hermione stood by him, but they couldn't hear the voice in his scar. They didn't see into Voldemort's mind. When Sirius died, no one truly understood the hole it left. Even Dumbledore kept him at a distance, for his own protection. In Order of the Phoenix, Harry shouted, "I just feel so angry all the time, like I'm going mad." It wasn't just rage, it was isolation, the kind that comes from knowing your pain is yours alone. He smiled at the Gryffindor table, but inside he walked alone. Snape didn't even pretend. His life was silence. The one person he trusted, Lily, was gone. The only man he confided in, Dumbledore, used him like a blade. He couldn't trust his colleagues. He couldn't open up to students. In Half-Blood Prince, he sat alone at the staff table, watching, always watching. He lived behind walls so high that even in death no one really knew him. Only Harry saw the truth, too late. Loneliness shaped them both. It sharpened their instincts, made them cautious, made them kind in ways they didn't always show. James lived in laughter. Harry and Snape survived in silence. Number 8. They were both outcasts. From the moment Harry stepped into Hogwarts, he felt like he didn't belong. Even as the boy who lived, whispers followed him down every corridor. Some admired, some doubted, but few truly understood. When the Sorting Hat almost placed him in Slytherin, he begged, "Not Slytherin, not Slytherin," because he already feared rejection. Students questioned his loyalty, his sanity, even his victories. "He's lying, isn't he?" they said after Voldemort returned. Harry wasn't a golden boy, he was a mystery, and mysteries make people uncomfortable. Snape lived that discomfort all his life. At Hogwarts he was the pale boy in second-hand robes. Even among Slytherins he was too dark, too intense. No one truly welcomed him. They feared him. James Potter was adored, effortlessly popular, always part of the group. But Snape? Like Harry, he stood apart, watched others laugh, learned early that being different meant being alone. Yet that same distance gave them both clarity. They saw what others missed. They listened in silence. They judged less because they knew what it felt like to be judged. Number 9, their magic came from intuition and emotion. James Potter cast spells with elegance. He was confident, polished, admired. His magic looked effortless, like part of a show. He flew through duels like a performer, wand spinning, smile flashing. But Harry's magic was nothing like that. He cast his first Patronus at 13, not because he had mastered the theory, but because he had to. The Dementor was closing in. He remembered his mother's scream and produced a stag so powerful it stunned the entire lake. "I knew I could do it this time because I'd already done it," he said. That wasn't technique. It was instinct, sharpened by love and fear. Snape, too, was no performer. He didn't flourish his wand. He didn't duel for applause. His magic was quiet, personal, and terrifyingly precise. His own spells, Sectum Sempra, Levicorpus, were born not in books but in his mind, scribbled in the margins of a tattered textbook. He created curses and counter-curses because no one else taught him what he needed to survive. Occlumency wasn't something he studied. It became his shield, his silence, his way to survive Voldemort. Dumbledore trusted him because his magic came from the deepest part of himself, not from polished technique. Both Harry and Snape wielded magic not as a show, but as a response to pain. When Harry's wand acted on its own in the graveyard, overpowering Voldemort, it was raw, reactive, alive. When Snape saved Draco from the curse that nearly killed him, he didn't ask permission, he moved, like instinct. They didn't follow magical tradition, they felt their spells, their power wasn't taught in classrooms. It was forged in loss, fear, and survival. And that's what made it so dangerous and so real. Number 10, hatred for privilege and inherited power. Harry never asked for fame, he never used it. When Draco Malfoy offered him a handshake in their first year, backed by the name of the Malfoys and centuries of pure blood pride, Harry simply said, "I think I can tell the wrong sort for myself." That moment defined him. He didn't want a throne or a spotlight. Even when the wizarding world called him the Chosen One, he flinched. He never bragged. He walked through Hogwarts not as a prince, but as a boy in second-hand robes, carrying too much grief for his age. Snape understood that kind of pride and hated it. He grew up poor, mocked for his patched clothes, his background, his accent. At Hogwarts he saw boys like James Potter and Sirius Black walk through the halls like they owned them. Not just popular, they were born into power. Severus watched them laugh, duel charm teachers, and escape trouble. And no matter how clever he was, how hard he tried, the world always reminded him, "You're not one of them." So when the Dark Lord whispered of power, Severus listened, not because he believed in blood, but because it promised revenge. But the older he grew, the more he saw the truth. Real strength was never in names or bloodlines. It was in choices, in sacrifice. In the shadows, both he and Harry made the same choice again and again, to stand for the weak, not for themselves. When Harry broke into Umbridge's office to help Mr. Weasley, when he refused to bow to Fudge, when he gave up his life for his friends, he wasn't acting like a hero. He was resisting the system that had failed him. Snape, too, spent years risking his life for people who would never thank him. They both served not because they were admired, but because it was right. James Potter never had to think about these things. He had respect, money, talent, and friends before he learned humility. Harry and Severus earned theirs in pain. That's why they distrusted power. That's why they refused to worship status. They both learned, in different ways, that real greatness doesn't wear a crown, it carries weight. Number 11, their worst fear was losing love, not losing battles. When Harry Potter first encountered Dementors on the Hogwarts Express, he collapsed, not because he feared death, but because he heard his mother screaming. "Not Harry! Please no, take me instead!" her final words. The cold that filled him wasn't fear of dying, it was the echo of loss, the echo of being left behind. Later in The Prisoner of Azkaban, Professor Lupin tells Harry, "You're not weak. Dementors affect you more than others because there are horrors in your past the others don't have." Harry wasn't afraid of the end. He was afraid of remembering it. Severus Snape feared nothing more than losing Lily Evans, and he lost her twice. Once when she turned away from him after he called her Mudblood, and again when Voldemort killed her. That was the night Snape's greatest fear became real. In the Deathly Hallows, Dumbledore asks him, "After all this time?" And Snape replies with one word, "Always." He didn't flinch at death. He didn't fear being discovered as a spy. He feared that his love would vanish into silence, unredeemed. So he stayed. Not for power, not for pride, for her. Harry and Snape were driven by love, not glory. They didn't fight for Gryffindor honor or house points. They fought because they couldn't bear the thought of losing the ones they loved. Harry charged into danger to save Sirius, then Ron, then Hermione, then Ginny, again and again. Snape, meanwhile, spent his life hiding in the shadows to protect the son of the woman he couldn't stop loving. They knew that wounds of the heart cut deeper than any curse. James Potter, for all his bravery, sought respect. He fought for pride, for justice, for ideals. But he never knew what it meant to live with guilt and longing every day. Harry did. Snape did. For them, the battlefield wasn't about triumph. It was about holding on to something they'd already lost, or something they couldn't afford to lose again. Number 12, their magic, was born of pain. Of all the wand-wielders in the wizarding world, few cast their spells with the same raw intensity as Harry Potter and Severus Snape. They did not master their craft through quiet study in candle-lit libraries or flourish through academic accolades. Their magic, though sometimes unrefined in execution, pulsed with emotion. It lived and breathed in the shadows of their memories. What united them? Though they stood on opposite sides of so many walls, was the fact that their greatest power came from pain, not as a weakness, but as a conduit. Their magic was carved from grief and forged in suffering. Harry, an orphan from infancy, learned to survive in a cupboard beneath the stairs before he ever held a wand. He did not grow up with lullabies or lessons. His first moments of magical strength were unconscious acts of desperation when he made the glass vanish at the zoo or leapt onto a roof to escape Dudley's fists. It was pain that fueled those moments, the quiet anguish of isolation, the ache of invisibility. Magic became a whisper of defiance against a world that had made him feel small. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in future, Hagrid had once said. But what made Harry legendary wasn't fame, it was how he channeled heartbreak into magic. Severus Snape, too, was shaped by hardship. Raised in a broken home where shouting echoed louder than love, he found solace not in people, but in potions and the secrets of the arcane. The Hogwarts Express, that fateful first ride, did not bring him friendship. It brought Lily Evans, and later, humiliation at the hands of James Potter. Yet in his love for Lily, he found his first tether to beauty. And when he lost her, he became the man with haunted eyes and a voice like knives. Snape's magic was meticulous, sharp-edged and obsessive, but beneath it lived agony. Every incantation, every potion, every protective spell he cast was a scream muffled by silence. Dumbledore once called him the bravest man I ever knew. He was, because bravery isn't in standing unscarred. It's in fighting while bleeding. The Patronus is among the most intimate forms of magic in J.K. Rowling's world. It is born not of logic, but of memory, of joy, powerful enough to repel despair. Yet for both Harry and Snape, their Patronuses were not born from joy, but from mourning. Snape's silvery doe, identical to Lily's, was the essence of a love that outlived death. It did not change even when she married another. It remained constant, frozen in time. When Dumbledore saw it, years after Lily's murder, he asked, "After all this time?" Snape answered, "Always." That single word held the weight of a lifetime. His Patronus was not a triumph, it was a wound. Harry's stag was different, yet not. It was not born of memory, but of hope. He had no recollection of James Potter playing with him, no bedtime stories or proud fatherly glances, and yet Harry conjured a Patronus that mirrored the animagus form of a man he barely knew. Because in his mind, James was more than a father. He was courage. He was warmth. He was the dream of a family that might have been. "Prongs!" Sirius had once whispered, misty-eyed. And Harry had stood on the shore of the Great Lake, driving back 100 Dementors, not with skill, but with longing. That was Harry's true power, not technical precision, but emotional clarity. Their spells were often imperfect in form, but devastating in effect. In the Department of Mysteries, when Bellatrix Lestrange taunted him, Harry's magic surged not from academic instruction, but from fury and anguish. He hurled spells that cracked the floor and rattled the air. When he chased her down and tried to cast the Cruciatus Curse, it failed, not because he lacked power, but because he lacked hate. Yet later, in the final confrontation with Voldemort, it was his understanding of love, death, and sacrifice that made his disarming charm unstoppable. Expelliarmus may have seemed simplistic, but in Harry's hands it became a sword. Snape, for all his bitter wit and disdainful lectures, was never just a teacher. His spells bore his fingerprint. He invented Sectum Sempra, a curse that mimicked the wounds of a sword, silent, sudden, lethal. It was not born of hatred, but of necessity, of self-defense in dark corridors where words failed. Yet even this dangerous magic had layers. When Harry used it on Draco, not understanding its gravity, Snape didn't scold. He reacted, desperately, furiously, because he recognized his own trauma mirrored in that boy's reckless spell. His correction was not disciplinary. It was a terrified father's instinct. Even in Occlumency, where Snape tried to block Harry from Voldemort's mind, the two collided not just through power, but pain. Snape's own memories burst through the barrier, a hurricane of shame and sorrow. A boy in threadbare clothes being mocked, a teenager calling the girl he loved a mudblood, a man begging Dumbledore to save her child. And Harry too suffered through the lessons, reliving the scream of his mother and the green flash that ended her life. The classroom became a battlefield of buried grief. There is something sacred in the way magic, in its purest form, responds to emotion, not calculation, not cleverness, but feeling. Both Harry and Snape stood in the center of that truth. Snape's potions were masterpieces, not just because he was intelligent, but because he poured himself into them. The Wolfsbane potion for Remus Lupin was not just a recipe, it was compassion distilled. For a man he loathed, he crafted a monthly salvation. That was Snape. Love, buried beneath acid. Number 13 both lived behind a mask. Of all the burdens Harry Potter had to carry, perhaps the most suffocating was the mask of the boy who lived. From the moment he arrived at Hogwarts, Harry was no longer just a child. He was a symbol, a savior, a legend in the making. Students stared, professors whispered, and expectations clung to him like shadows. But behind the green eyes and lightning bolt scar was a boy who felt lost more often than brave. He wore his courage like armor, but underneath he carried fears he dared not speak aloud. When Cedric Diggory died and Voldemort returned, no one believed him. When he screamed in nightmares, no one could hear him. His pain had to stay locked away because the world needed a hero, not a broken teenager. Like a mirror darkened by time and bitterness, Severus Snape bore his own disguise. To the Death Eaters, he was a loyal servant of the Dark Lord. To Dumbledore, a secret weapon forged by guilt and love. But no side fully trusted him. Not once did the Order of the Phoenix thank him. Not once did a student glimpse the scars beneath his cold eyes. He protected them in silence, earning only suspicion and hatred. He insulted Harry, scorned Neville, and humiliated Hermione. But it was all part of a role too dangerous to break. To fail in his act, even once, meant death. Yet the heaviest mask he wore wasn't for the world. It was the one he used to survive himself. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Harry's internal turmoil reached its peak. "I don't want to be human," he shouted inwardly when Sirius died. But outside he clenched his fist and kept moving. He never told Ron or Hermione how much the prophecy haunted him. He never admitted how lonely it felt to be the chosen one. Instead, he smiled in public, trained with Dumbledore's army, and marched forward as if made of steel. But each lie to his friends, each swallowed fear, widened the distance between who he was and who he pretended to be. He thought he was being brave. But in truth, he was just learning how to survive behind a mask. Snape's mask was far older and carved with sharper edges. Since his school days, he learned that vulnerability was a weakness the world punished. When Lily chose James, Snape buried the boy who had once loved with purity and became a man who loved with punishment. His sarcasm became a blade, his eyes narrowed into suspicion, and his voice dripped disdain. At times he seemed to enjoy cruelty, but it was always a wall. It kept people out. It kept his heart from breaking again. And when Dumbledore tasked him with the impossible, protect the child of the man he hated and the woman he had loved, Snape never refused. But he never forgave life either. Harry's friendship with Luna Lovegood revealed the cracks in his mask. Luna, with her dreamy honesty, never asked Harry to pretend. She didn't want the chosen one, she just saw Harry. And in moments with her, he didn't need to wear the armor. Yet those were rare lights in a life lived under constant scrutiny. When he prepared to face death in the Deathly Hallows, he walked alone into the forbidden forest, whispering, "I'm ready to die." It wasn't bravery anymore. It was surrender. But even then he hid his terror. For Ron, for Hermione, for the fallen. He wore the mask of resolve even when his heart trembled. Snape's ultimate moment of vulnerability came only after death. "Look, me?" he begged, his final words to Harry echoing a life of unspoken longing. In his memories, Harry saw the truth, the endless regret, the quiet heroism, the isolation. "Always," Snape had said when asked if he still loved Lily. That one word destroyed every lie he had lived. In that moment, Harry saw what Snape had been hiding all along, not hate, not evil, but unbearable grief. They both knew what it meant to be alone in a crowded room. Harry, after Cedric's death, after Sirius's fall, felt as though no one could understand the weight he carried. Even when surrounded by friends, he often felt like a stranger to himself. In The Half-Blood Prince, after Dumbledore's death, he didn't cry in front of others. He didn't allow himself to mourn publicly. He pressed on, pretending strength. But inside, something had shattered. He learned to smile when needed, to fight when expected, to inspire when others faltered. But he was always two people, the Harry they needed and the Harry who needed saving. Snape, likewise, knew what it meant to speak with lies and silence. He told Voldemort only what he had to. He gave Dumbledore only what he could. The rest he kept buried in the pensive. When he stared at Harry across a desk, he saw James's face and Lily's eyes, a living contradiction, and still he protected him. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, he threw himself in front of Harry, Ron, and Hermione in the Shrieking Shack. No one ever thanked him, no one ever saw what it cost. But he kept doing it, because that was his penance. Even the way they spoke reflected their masks. Harry's tone often turned defensive or dismissive when asked about his feelings. He changed the subject, laughed things off, pushed emotions away. Snape, on the other hand, used sarcasm as a shield. "Fame isn't everything," he snapped in the first book. But what he meant was, you don't know the price of being seen. Both had to perform, Snape as the spy, Harry as the saviour, and neither had the freedom to just be. Dumbledore never asked Harry how he felt. He told him what he must do. He gave him a mission. He saw the boy, but only through the lens of prophecy. Likewise, Dumbledore saw Snape as a tool, a necessary element in a larger plan. He trusted them both, yes, but not with their own healing. He asked them to suffer, and they obeyed, not because they wanted to be heroes, but because they believed they had no choice. Number 14, love as a path to redemption. Of all the parallels that exist in the Harry Potter saga, none is more haunting, more human, than the one that binds Harry Potter and Severus Snape. Though separated by age, temperament, and the choices of a shared past, they are two sides of the same coin, both marked by love that did not save them but transformed them. For Snape, love was a burden of guilt, a lifelong penance for a fatal mistake. For Harry, it was the reason to walk willingly into death, armed only with the hope that his sacrifice would protect the world he loved. They were not lovers in the traditional sense of receiving and being cherished. Their love was not requited. It was not gentle. It was never enough to bring them happiness, but it was everything that made them human. Severus Snape's story begins not with power or cruelty, but with a boy watching a girl on a swing in a dusty park. Lily Evans was his escape from the crushing grey of Spinner's End. She was the first light in a life that would be mostly shadow. His affection for her was awkward, intense, pure. He saw in her what he could never see in himself: grace, kindness, brilliance. But his love, as raw and powerful as it was, became twisted with bitterness and shame. In his desperation to belong to something greater than the miserable world of his father, he chose the dark arts and the company of Death Eaters, believing strength would be enough. It wasn't. It never was. When he called Lily a mudblood in front of the whole school, he planted the seed of his own damnation. And yet, after she died, his love for her did not die with her. It fossilized, became the stone upon which he built the rest of his life. Always, he whispered to Dumbledore when asked if he still cared for Lily after all these years. That single word tells us everything. For Snape, love was no longer something that warmed or healed. It was duty, pain, repentance. He vowed to protect the boy she left behind, even though that boy was a living symbol of her choice to love someone else. Every time Snape looked into Harry's green eyes, he saw Lily. And every time he saw Lily, he remembered that he had failed her. Harry, too, came to understand that love was not about receiving. He never knew his parents, but he loved them. He loved Sirius Black, who gave him fleeting glimpses of what family could be and then lost him. He loved Dumbledore even after discovering the old wizard's manipulations. He loved Ron and Hermione with the fierce loyalty of someone who feared always that he would lose them next. But perhaps most significantly, Harry chose to love the world that had often rejected him. He chose to fight not out of hatred for Voldemort, but out of compassion for those who could not fight for themselves. It was in the Forbidden Forest with the Resurrection Stone in his palm that Harry proved he understood Snape in a way no one else ever could. He did not fight to win. He walked to his death unarmed and vulnerable because he believed his death might buy others a chance to live. In that moment, Harry became the mirror of Snape, not through bitterness, but through sacrifice. "Does it hurt?" he asked the shades of his parents, Sirius and Remus. Yes, it would hurt, but he would do it anyway. Like Snape, Harry loved beyond death. The tragedy of Snape is that no one but Dumbledore and Harry ever saw the depth of his love. To the world, he was a bitter, cold teacher with a cruel streak. His students feared him. The Order of the Phoenix tolerated him. Voldemort trusted him. But no one understood that everything he did, from shielding Harry from curses to misleading the Dark Lord, was a prayer for redemption that he never expected to be answered. His love did not redeem him in life, but it gave his life purpose. When Harry stood over Snape's broken body in the shrieking shack and looked into his eyes, he saw them fill with tears. It was not fear of death that moved Snape in that moment. It was the need to pass something on, his memories, his truth, his legacy. The last thing he ever gave Harry was not advice or strength, but the truth of his heart. Through those memories, Harry learned that Snape's greatest act of courage was not killing Dumbledore. It was choosing every day to protect the son of the woman he loved and lost. That is not heroism born of glory. That is love in its most tortured form. Snape's love was never rewarded. He never heard Lily forgive him. He never received thanks. But Harry, standing in the headmaster's office, surrounded by the portraits of the dead, told his son, "You were named for 2 headmasters of Hogwarts. One of them was a Slytherin, and he was the bravest man I ever knew." That was the only reward Snape ever got, to be remembered by the one person who finally understood. Number 15, Intolerance to Hypocrisy. Harry Potter never sought to please those in power. From his first year at Hogwarts, it became clear that his moral compass pointed firmly toward truth and justice, no matter how inconvenient. When Draco Malfoy mocked Ron's poverty or Hermione's muggle-born status, Harry didn't ignore it. He acted, often recklessly, but always sincerely. Even in his early years, Harry displayed a raw intolerance for pretense, particularly from those who used their influence to mask cruelty. That same unflinching honesty pulsed within Severus Snape, though his expression of it was cold and bitter. 2 souls, worlds apart in demeanor, yet united by one thing, an unyielding refusal to tolerate hypocrisy. Harry's most striking clash with institutional falsehood came during his 5th year, when Dolores Umbridge turned Hogwarts into a parody of justice. She wore pink cardigans and smiled sweetly while torturing students and silencing truth. Harry could have chosen silence like so many others, but he spoke out. "I must not tell lies," he told her, even as her quill etched the words into his flesh. It was not just courage, it was his allergy to deceit, especially when it was cloaked in authority. Snape may not have written that sentence into Harry's hand, but he understood it. He had endured years of watching the ministry bow to Death Eaters who wore respectable masks in daylight and committed atrocities at night. Snape, too, despised falseness, though he expressed it in venom and silence rather than open defiance. He loathed Lucius Malfoy, not only for his elitism, but for his duplicity. Lucius spoke of purity and honor while hiding behind bribes and influence, avoiding Azkaban through silver-tongued excuses. Snape, on the other hand, never denied his past. He bore the mark of the Death Eaters openly, a permanent brand of shame that he never sought to hide. Even his double life as Dumbledore's spy was driven not by deception, but by duty. He concealed his allegiance only to protect others, never for personal gain. He told Dumbledore, "You have no idea what it means to be a spy, do you, Potter?" But he might have been speaking to the world. The contrast with James Potter is striking. James wore charisma-like armor. He knew how to perform decency, to smile at professors, to shine on the Quidditch pitch. But behind the laughter was arrogance. He hexed Snape for sport, confident that others would laugh along. Harry, upon seeing this memory, was shaken. "You're just arrogant as your father," Snape once snarled. And in that moment, Harry saw the painful truth. James had not always been the hero Harry believed him to be. He had worn a mask of charm, and it took years and Lily's love to strip it away. Harry's path diverged from his father's not just in deeds, but in spirit. He never cared for popularity. When the Daily Prophet smeared his name, calling him delusional, Harry held to the truth. When even his classmates doubted him, he refused to back down. The same fire burned in Snape, though cooled by age and regret. Snape cared nothing for approval. His lessons were harsh, his punishments cruel, but he never lied about who he was. His scorn for Trelawney's dramatics or Lockhart's vanity was not just irritation, it was moral disgust. He saw through their illusions and had no patience for the game. Lockhart, especially, was everything Snape hated, a fraud who climbed the ladder of fame by stealing others' stories. His smile was wide, his robes dazzling, but Snape looked at him and saw nothing but cowardice. "Merely a memory charm," Snape muttered with contempt after Lockhart's deception was exposed. Harry, too, despised Lockhart almost instantly, not just because he was incompetent, but because he was false. Even as a child, Harry's instincts recoiled from superficial kindness, masking hollow intent. This shared intolerance for hypocrisy extended to their view of Dumbledore. Harry revered the headmaster, but he didn't shy away from confronting him. After Sirius's death, Harry's grief erupted. "You knew this would happen," he accused. His voice broke not out of disrespect, but because he couldn't stand being left in the dark. Snape had his own grudges against Dumbledore. He hated being used, hated the games, hated that the greater good required so much personal cost. Yet both men ultimately served that cause, not because they were obedient, but because they believed it was right. Their defiance was not aimless rebellion. It was deeply rooted in integrity. When Harry confronted Rufus Scrimgeour and refused to be the Ministry's poster boy, he said, "I don't like being used." The line could have come from Snape. Both refused to be pawns, both understood that power without truth was dangerous, and both paid for it. Snape with his life, Harry with years of misunderstanding and pain. Neither man sought to be liked. They sought only to do what was necessary, even when it meant walking alone. Snape's honesty was so raw that it made others recoil. He insulted students, belittled colleagues, and held grudges. But his truth was never for show. He told Dumbledore, "You take a great deal for granted. Perhaps I've changed my mind." It was a rare moment of rebellion, not from pride, but from the agony of serving a mission that tore him apart. He never pretended to be noble. His courage lived in the shadows, in silence, in enduring the scorn of those he protected. His truth wasn't comfortable, but it was real. Harry's truth, by contrast, blazed in the open. He shouted in the Great Hall, "He's back," after Voldemort's return, refusing to play politics. He led Dumbledore's army not to gain followers, but to teach others to fight back. He gave interviews to the Quibbler when no one else would listen. He stood on the edge of belief, urging others to see beyond comforting lies. And even when he was wrong, when he suspected Draco of murder in 6th year, his motives were the same, a refusal to let evil hide behind charm. Both men had a painful relationship with loyalty. Snape's was bitter. He served Dumbledore not out of love, but penance. Harry's was fiery. He stood by friends, even when it cost him dearly. But in both cases, their loyalty sprang from a deep personal ethic, not to systems or traditions, but to principles. Snape did not betray Voldemort because he was caught. He betrayed him because a woman died. That single act, Lily's murder, shattered the last vestiges of any illusion Snape had left about what he'd been serving. He saw the horror and turned, even though it meant losing everything. Harry, too, turned his back on tradition. He rejected the Sorting Hat's offer of Slytherin. He defied the Triwizard Tournament's rules to save others. He walked into the Forbidden Forest, unarmed, to die, not because he was told to, but because it was right. Snape walked that same path, secretly, every day, for 17 years. Each potion brewed, each glance toward Harry, each conversation with Dumbledore, all were acts of endurance, not for glory, not for redemption, just truth. Even their hatred was honest. Snape's bitterness toward James, toward Sirius, toward Harry himself, it was never disguised. He didn't pretend to forgive. He didn't wear smiles to hide loathing. He showed it, raw and unvarnished. Harry's own hatred of Umbridge, of Voldemort, of Snape at times, was just as fierce. But even at his worst, Harry never faked affection. He didn't flatter or manipulate. He faced people as they were and expected the same. It's why both Harry and Snape struggled with social ease. Neither could master the art of politeness for its own sake. Harry stumbled in his interviews, grew angry at the press, often said the wrong thing. Snape was worse, cold, biting, intimidating. But both cut through pleasantries and went to the heart of things. When Harry said to Scrimgeour, "You're interfering at Hogwarts," he didn't couch it in diplomacy. When Snape told Lupin he shouldn't be trusted around students, he wasn't seeking consensus. They were simply saying what they believed to be true. This made them vulnerable to misunderstanding. The world called Harry a liar and an attention seeker. It called Snape a villain and a traitor. But neither man changed. They held to their beliefs through ridicule, isolation, and fear. And when the final moments came, both acted from that same core. Harry walked to death, trusting in the truth. Snape gave his memories, trusting that one day Harry would understand. And Harry did. He named his son Albus Severus, not to forgive Snape's cruelty, but to honor his integrity. He told the boy, "You were named after 2 headmasters of Hogwarts. One of them was a Slytherin, and he was the bravest man I ever knew." Brave not for fighting in battles, but for resisting illusion, for bearing pain without mask or medal, for living a truth so sharp it cut even him. What unites Harry Potter and Severus Snape is not kindness or charm or even warmth. It is a merciless clarity, a hatred of lies, a refusal to bow, a demand that the world be honest, even when it hurts. They may have despised each other, but in that final reckoning, they stood on the same side, against all the masks, against all the games, for truth. Number 16, unforgivable mistakes they couldn't forgive themselves. Of all the burdens that Harry Potter carried, none weighed heavier than the deaths he believed were his fault. He was only 14 when Cedric Diggory died, killed by Peter Pettigrew on Voldemort's order. But Harry never forgave himself for suggesting they take the cup together. Cedric had been kind, brave, and decent. He hadn't deserved to die. Harry knew that, and yet the image of Cedric's lifeless body haunted him in dreams and memories. "Kill the spare," Voldemort had said, and the words echoed in Harry's head with every step he took back to Hogwarts. Dumbledore tried to comfort him, to explain that Voldemort was the only one to blame, but Harry couldn't hear reason through the noise of his guilt. That same guilt reared its head when Sirius Black died. In the Department of Mysteries, Harry had led his friends into a trap, convinced that Sirius was being tortured. The vision had been a lie, planted in his mind by Voldemort himself, but Harry didn't see the manipulation. He only saw the consequences. Bellatrix Lestrange's curse hit Sirius squarely in the chest, and the man who had given Harry a glimpse of family was gone. No amount of comfort from Lupin or Dumbledore could change the fact that Harry had believed a vision and run headlong into danger, dragging others with him. "He's gone," Lupin had said, but the words only fueled Harry's fury at himself. Dumbledore's death added another chapter to Harry's internal torment. Though Snape had delivered the final blow, Harry blamed himself for not being faster, for not saving Dumbledore when he had the chance. The night on the astronomy tower was seared into Harry's memory. Paralyzed by Dumbledore's silent command, hiding and watching helplessly as Snape raised his wand, Harry relived that moment countless times. Dumbledore had trusted him, had given him pieces of the puzzle, and yet Harry always believed he had failed the greatest wizard he had ever known. "You are the only one I can trust," Dumbledore had said, and those words became a curse. Even in the heat of war, Harry carried the dead with him. Dobby, Fred, Tonks, Lupin, all of them added to the fire that burned inside him. Each time someone fell, Harry silently wondered what he could have done differently. It didn't matter that he was just a boy. It didn't matter that he was up against the darkest wizard in a century. What mattered was that people he loved kept dying, and in his mind, he was always a step too late. This self-inflicted guilt made Harry a deeply lonely figure. He was surrounded by friends, but he believed his pain was something they couldn't understand. Hermione and Ron tried to help, but how could they grasp the weight Harry placed on his own shoulders? He had seen into Voldemort's mind. He had walked to his own death willingly. He bore the burden of being the chosen one, and in his quietest moments he questioned whether that burden was worth the cost. Severus Snape's guilt, however, was of a different breed. His mistakes had not been accidents or misjudgments. They were choices, dark, deliberate, and irreversible. When he overheard part of the prophecy in the Hog's head and relayed it to Voldemort, he did not think beyond his allegiance to the Dark Lord. He did not know it would lead to the death of the only person he had ever truly loved. But ignorance was no excuse. When Voldemort targeted the Potters, Snape realized too late what his actions had wrought. The death of Lily Evans tore through Severus like a dagger. He begged Dumbledore to protect her. He offered anything, gave up everything. But it wasn't enough. Lily died, and Snape knew the blood on Voldemort's hands had passed through his own. "You disgust me," Dumbledore had said when Snape asked for Lily's safety and not James or Harry's. Snape never denied it. He knew he was loathsome. He chose to live with that knowledge. So he stayed. He joined the Order of the Phoenix. He took up a post at Hogwarts, walking the same halls where he had once insulted Lily and watched her choose someone else. He taught Harry, the living image of James, with Lily's eyes, a daily reminder of his guilt. He endured scorn from the students, mistrust from the Order, and danger from both sides of the war. Not out of heroism, but because he believed he had no right to peace. Always, he told Dumbledore when asked if he still loved her. It wasn't romance, it was a penance. Snape could have left. He could have disappeared, taken refuge in a quiet corner of the world, and lived with his remorse. But that would have been too merciful. Instead, he placed himself in the eye of the storm. He allowed Voldemort to trust him again. He committed acts that turned stomachs, played roles that endangered his soul, all so he could protect the son of the woman he had destroyed. His life was a punishment, and he welcomed it. Where Harry's guilt was emotional and empathetic, Snape's was calculated and philosophical. He knew precisely what he had done. He analyzed every step that led him to Lily's death, and every decision afterward was made to counterbalance the original sin. But both men arrived at the same place, a life defined by unrelenting regret. They never spoke of it. Snape never offered Harry a glimpse into his grief, and Harry never shared his burdens. Their relationship was one of animosity and a misunderstanding, yet in truth they were bound by the same invisible chain. Both carried the dead inside them. Both saw ghosts when they looked in the mirror. Both chose to suffer rather than seek absolution. It is tempting to draw a line between them and James Potter, who seemed to live with the buoyancy of a man who had made mistakes but moved on. James bullied Severus, yes, and fought recklessly, but he grew, matured, became a husband and father. He did not spend his life repenting. He was bold and loved without shame, and perhaps that made him happier, but it also made him lighter. Harry and Snape were weighed down by their own darkness in a way James never was. Snape's final act, giving Harry his memories, was not a plea for redemption. It was an act of truth. "Look at me," he said, as he died, and in that moment he asked only to be seen. Not forgiven, not understood, just seen. And when Harry saw those memories, when he realized what Snape had carried, he finally understood what true remorse looked like. It was not loud, it was not public, it was not rewarded. It was quiet, painful, and eternal. In the aftermath of the war, Harry named his son Albus Severus and said he was named for the bravest man I ever knew. But that statement wasn't about heroism in battle. It was about living with guilt, and choosing to do right in spite of it. Harry knew that kind of bravery because he lived it too. Harry never forgot those he had lost. He visited their graves, he spoke their names, he carried them in his silence, and while the world saw him as a saviour, he saw himself as the boy who couldn't save Cedric, the godson who let Sirius fall, the student who couldn't stop Snape from killing Dumbledore. There is no spell in the wizarding world to erase guilt. There is no potion that cures the heart. For both Harry and Severus, the path forward was not about forgetting, but about remembering rightly. Their pain did not make them weak, it forged their strength. Their stories are not only about magic and prophecy. They are stories about the weight of regret and how two men, so different and yet so alike, chose to live with it. Harry carried his guilt like a wound that never closed. Severus bore his like a badge he refused to remove. In the end, their redemption was never about others forgiving them. It was about the choices they made each day to protect, to remember, and to atone. They could have walked away, but they stayed, and in that decision lies their deepest, most unforgivable humanity. Number 17, their lives always hovered on the edge of death. Harry Potter had barely turned 11 when he came face to face with death. From the moment he stepped into the wizarding world, death became his silent companion. At the end of his first year, a trapdoor led him into a confrontation with Lord Voldemort himself, weak and clinging to the back of another's head. And yet, even then, death circled him. In the dungeons beneath Hogwarts, Harry was not just saving the Philosopher's Stone, he was already standing on the threshold between life and death. The mirror of Erised, the stone, and the burning touch of love passed down by Lily. They were his first shields, but the message was clear. His life was no longer his own. He was marked. Severus Snape's journey into mortality was quieter, more self-imposed. As a young Death Eater, he had chosen a path of darkness. But the moment he knelt before Albus Dumbledore and begged for Lily Potter's protection, he sealed a different kind of fate. "Hide them. Hide them all, then. Hide her," he whispered in anguish. From then on, he became a man who walked willingly into the fire. A double agent who lived in constant peril. Every word, every glance, every step he took within Voldemort's circle was a gamble. He played the part of loyal follower with meticulous care, knowing that a single misstep would lead to his death. A death he expected, a death he accepted. Harry's second year brought a deadly serpent into the castle's plumbing, and still he ran toward danger. When others were petrified and the school was on the verge of closing, Harry descended into the Chamber of Secrets. There, a basilisk nearly ended his life. "You were brilliant, Fawkes," he said, covered in blood, as the phoenix's tears healed him. But the victory was more than a child's bravery. It was another moment where Harry stared death in the face and chose to fight, not for glory, but because no one else could. Each time he survived, the gap between himself and the normalcy of life widened. Safety was no longer his to expect. Snape, meanwhile, fought a war that no one celebrated. While Harry battled beasts and curses, Snape navigated the far more treacherous terrain of lies. He brewed poisons under Voldemort's orders. He stood in graveyards, watched innocents tortured, and had to offer no reaction. His soul endured a constant storm of hypocrisy, horror, and guilt. He was not a boy chosen by fate, but a man who had chosen to suffer, to repent. His entire life became a series of daily suicides, of his pride, his comfort, his name. No one would ever cheer for him. No one would ever know. That was the price. The Triwizard Tournament should have been a spectacle, but for Harry it was another brush with death. A dragon's breath nearly scorched him. Merpeople guarded drowning friends. A labyrinth shifted with illusions and traps. And finally, in a graveyard soaked in moonlight and betrayal, he watched Cedric Diggory fall. Kill the spare. And just like that, Cedric was gone. It wasn't war, it wasn't justice, it was death, sudden, arbitrary, and cruel. Harry returned with a corpse and trauma no spell could heal. He had touched a dead boy's body. He had watched Voldemort rise again. He knew now that survival wasn't guaranteed, and destiny was not merciful. Snape's survival was no more certain. When he stood before the resurrected Dark Lord, when he met those red eyes, he knew the cost of his duplicity had increased tenfold. To lie to Voldemort now was to invite agony. To protect Harry meant risking exposure every second. And yet he didn't flinch. He offered his services, his wand, his loyalty. Voldemort accepted, blind to the truth, but Snape knew. "I'm not such a coward," he had once told Dumbledore, and those words never left him. He became Voldemort's confidant, Dumbledore's weapon, and Harry's unseen guardian. His life was a tightrope walk above the abyss, and he never looked down. In the Order of the Phoenix, Harry became angrier, more reckless. He saw Sirius die, another death that felt undeserved. His godfather's body fell behind a veil, and Harry screamed. "He can't come back, can he?" The question had no answer. From that point, death became real in a way it hadn't before. Sirius was supposed to be his anchor to a family that had been stolen. Now he was gone too. Harry's heart filled with grief, but also resolve. If death would come for everyone he loved, then he would meet it, standing, wand raised, heart bared. Snape stood alone in that year more than ever. The Order did not trust him. The students loathed him. Dumbledore was dying, and he was being asked to do the unthinkable. Kill him, end the only man who had seen his pain and trusted him anyway. "You must be the one to kill me, Severus," Dumbledore had said. Snape had balked, but he had not refused. He would murder the only person who believed in him, and live with the consequences, because to Snape, death was not the worst fate. To fail in protecting Lily's son, that would be unforgivable. The night on the astronomy tower was one of quiet damnation. Snape ascended the stairs. Draco hesitated. The Death Eaters watched. Dumbledore begged, eyes full of silent pleading. "Severus, please." And with that, the curse flew. Dumbledore collapsed. Snape fled. The world called him traitor. The students, the Order, even Harry, all believed him a murderer. But Snape kept going. He did not explain. He did not defend. He carried the burden and disappeared into shadows, his name smeared with blood. Yet he had saved Draco. He had preserved the mission, and he had kept his vow. Harry, now the chosen one in more than name, found death waiting at every turn in the final book. Horcruxes, curses, traps, and betrayals. The path to victory was a graveyard. He walked it with Ron and Hermione, but the weight was his alone. He saw Dobby die in his arms. He buried him with his own hands. He watched Fred fall, Tonks and Lupin perish, and Hogwarts burn. But when the truth came, when he learned he was the final Horcrux, he did not hesitate. "I must die," he whispered, and went into the forest. No glory, no spectacle, only silence. Snape, in that same war, made his final stand. Cornered by Voldemort in the Shrieking Shack, he realized his usefulness was over. "The wand will not work properly for me until the Master is dead," Voldemort reasoned, and so he unleashed Nagini. Snape collapsed, blood pooling, breath fading. No one came to save him, but Harry did come, and in his final moments, Snape gave him memory, the truth. "Look at me," he gasped, and Harry did. The boy with Lily's eyes, the only fragment of her that remained. And then he was gone, with no fanfare, no final comfort. Harry entered the King's Cross between life and death and met Dumbledore. He had died, but not fully. "Do not pity the dead, Harry. Pity the living, and above all, those who live without love." He was given a choice, to go back. And he did, for others. to finish what had begun with the scar. He returned, rose again, and faced Voldemort one last time. "I am the true master of the Elder Wand," he declared. And with that, he ended the tyrant. But Harry's soul had changed. He had died willingly. He had accepted it. He had learned what it meant to live while dying every day. Snape never came back. He wasn't offered a second chance. He had given everything already. But in the pensive, Harry saw it all. The memories, the pain, the sacrifice. "You have your mother's eyes," Dumbledore had said, and now Harry knew why it mattered. Snape had loved her, protected her son, lived a life without reward, and died in disgrace, but not to Harry. "I name my son Albus Severus," he would one day say. "You were named for 2 headmasters of Hogwarts. One of them was a Slytherin, and he was the bravest man I ever knew." Both Harry and Snape existed on borrowed time. Each day they survived was not a triumph, but a delay. Snape lived in silence. Harry lived in the storm, but they shared this, the knowledge that death could come at any moment. And they did not run. They stayed. They fought. They chose to suffer, to endure, to act. They were men of burden, not applause. James Potter died swiftly, wand in hand, a Gryffindor's death, noble and valiant. But Harry and Snape were not given that luxury. Their deaths were long, stretched across years of sacrifice. Every day they woke up and chose to walk into the fire again. Harry bore a curse on his forehead. Snape bore it in his soul. Neither sought thanks. Harry never demanded recognition. Snape didn't live to be understood. They were different in so many ways. The boy who lived, the man who hated. But fate intertwined them. One was a symbol, the other a shadow, and yet both balanced on the edge of mortality for the sake of others. It wasn't heroism that defined them. It was endurance. The willingness to keep going, to keep losing, to keep hoping, even in silence. Harry's journey was filled with light, but he walked through darkness. Snape's journey was wrapped in shadow, but it was fueled by a hidden light. Love. And so, as the saga ended, one was buried, one lived. But both had danced with death. Both had known its scent, its presence, its promise. And both had made peace with it long before it came. Number 18, their relationships with Dumbledore were painful and complex. Harry had always looked up to Albus Dumbledore. Since his first year at Hogwarts, the headmaster had been more than a school leader. He had been a guide, a protector, a symbol of hope in a world that constantly threatened to break. But Harry's trust, once blind and unwavering, began to crack the moment he stood before the shattered remains of Dumbledore's secrets. He had believed in him so fully, believed that Dumbledore's hand on his shoulder was the touch of a man who saw him as more than a weapon. Yet, when the old wizard fell from the astronomy tower, Harry realized that he knew almost nothing about the man who had shaped his entire path. The discovery of Dumbledore's manipulations came in pieces like glass crunching underfoot. It began with the revelation that Harry himself was a Horcrux, something Voldemort had unintentionally created, but that Dumbledore had always suspected. The boy who lived, the chosen one, was born to die. "You were the 7th Horcrux, Harry," said the memory of Dumbledore in the liminal space between life and death. But before that moment, Dumbledore had never spoken these words aloud. Harry had spent his youth trusting a man who had quietly prepared him for slaughter. This betrayal bled slowly into Harry's heart. He had grown up without a father, and in many ways Dumbledore had filled that hollow. Yet unlike James Potter, whose relationship with the headmaster had been filled with admiration and simplicity, Harry's bond was more complex. James had been a bright, confident student, a Gryffindor golden boy who had never needed to question his place in the world. Dumbledore had blessed his marriage, smiled at his successes, and likely mourned him deeply, but there had been no subterfuge between them, no hidden schemes, no withheld truths. For Severus Snape, the relationship with Dumbledore was built on debt, dependence, and quiet resentment. Dumbledore had promised to protect Lily Potter's son, and Snape had held him to that promise with a fury born of love and guilt. When Dumbledore agreed to protect Harry, Snape offered something in return, his soul, piece by piece. "Don't tell me now that you've grown to care for the boy," Dumbledore once said with that cutting softness that masked cruelty. And Snape's answer? For him, expecto patronum, revealed a man whose grief had never died, whose allegiance was chained to a ghost. The headmaster demanded more from Snape than anyone else. He asked him to lie, to kill, to live 2 lives with no honor in either. Snape walked among Death Eaters with a branded arm, and among students who despised him. He endured slander, scorn, and danger at every turn. Dumbledore never offered absolution. He simply asked for more, and Snape, for all his bitterness, complied. He did not do it out of devotion to the cause, nor out of loyalty to Dumbledore himself. He did it because he loved Lily Evans, and because Dumbledore had the power to direct that love into something meaningful. Harry, too, became part of that machinery. By his 6th year, Dumbledore led Harry through memories like stepping stones across a dark lake. He showed him the past of Tom Riddle, unravelled the truth behind the Horcruxes, and drew Harry closer to the final confrontation, but he never told him everything. "You must not be told yet," Dumbledore said, always, "not yet." And so Harry walked willingly into danger, not realizing he was also walking into death. The mentor who had once felt like family had treated him as a chess piece. The pawn was not meant to understand the whole board. When Snape stood over Dumbledore's broken body, wand still raised, eyes unreadable, he felt no triumph. He had killed a man who had asked him to. The world saw a traitor, but in truth he had followed one final command. "Severus, please." These were not pleas for mercy. These were reminders of the plan. Dumbledore had accepted death. He had orchestrated it. He had asked Snape to bear the burden, to carry the stain of murder for the sake of Draco Malfoy, for the safety of the plan, for the completion of a game so twisted that even the victors could not rejoice. And when Harry later watched Snape die, when he caught the memories falling like bloodied petals from the dying man's mind, he saw the truth. He saw the lonely child, the broken man, the unacknowledged hero. He saw Dumbledore's cruelty and vision in equal measure. It was only through Snape's eyes that Harry truly understood the complexity of Dumbledore's leadership. It was not benign, it was not pure. It was brilliant, cold, and devastating. "I sometimes think we sought too soon," Dumbledore once told Snape. It was a line filled with wistful regret, an acknowledgement of Snape's lifelong isolation in Slytherin, but it was also too little, too late. Dumbledore had used that isolation to his advantage. He had known Snape would walk in darkness and had simply steered the shadows toward his own ends. Snape had been many things: spy, professor, protector, but he had never been free. Dumbledore offered no friendship, only purpose. The same could be said of Harry. Dumbledore loved him, yes, but it was a strategic love. It was the kind of love that demanded sacrifice. "You are the best hope we have," he told Harry again and again. The boy who had been denied affection his entire life was offered conditional care, so long as he continued on the path Dumbledore had set. Even the resurrection stone, hidden in the first snitch, had come with a message. "I open at the close." It was always meant to be Harry's death sentence, delivered in a whisper. Yet neither Harry nor Snape turned away. Both could have rebelled, could have said no, could have chosen easier paths, but they didn't. Snape gave his life to protect the son of the woman he loved. Harry walked into the Forbidden Forest, heart pounding, wand at his side, ready to die. Both bore the weight of Dumbledore's expectations, and both were changed forever by it. They emerged from his influence not as his shadows but as his unintended consequences. The scars left by Dumbledore ran deep. Harry's faith was shattered, then reforged through understanding. He came to see Dumbledore not as a saint, but as a man, flawed, brilliant, manipulative, and burdened. In the forest, when Harry saw Dumbledore's image in the white haze of King's Cross, he did not greet him with reverence, but with questions. "Was I better off not knowing?" he asked. And Dumbledore, eyes filled with pain, admitted his own failings. "I cared more for your happiness than your knowing the truth." It was the most human thing he had ever said. For Snape, there was no such reconciliation. He never had the chance to confront Dumbledore's memory, to voice his anger or his exhaustion. His service ended in death, unthanked and misunderstood. But Harry carried that legacy forward. By naming his son Albus Severus, he offered a tribute not just to courage, but to endurance, the kind of quiet daily bravery that went unseen. In doing so, he acknowledged the shared suffering that bound him to Snape. Harry and Snape were never friends. They were never even allies in the traditional sense. But they were both forged in the same fire. They had both looked to Dumbledore for guidance and received instead a riddle. They had both been marked by the headmaster's grand plan and left with nothing but ashes and memory. And yet they both found a kind of redemption in the aftermath. Harry lived to love and protect. Snape died doing the same. Their stories intersect not in the battles they fought, but in the wounds they carried. Each bore the weight of Dumbledore's trust, and each paid for it with pain. That pain became their bond, unspoken, invisible, but real. In the shattered remains of a war fought in secret and silence, Harry and Snape stand on either side of a grave. One was buried with honor, the other was buried with mystery. But both had been soldiers in Dumbledore's war. The complexity of their relationship with Dumbledore is not found in a single moment, but in the layers of betrayal and belief. It is the moment Harry watches Snape's memories and realizes, too late, that the man he hated had protected him all along. It is the moment Snape agrees to kill a man he serves but does not love. It is the realization that Dumbledore, for all his wisdom, built a world where trust was a weapon and sacrifice was currency. Harry's journey ends not in vengeance, but in understanding. He does not destroy Dumbledore's memory. He allows it to live with all its contradictions. He visits the headmaster's portrait, speaks to it, but no longer worships it. He forgives him, but he does not forget. And that is the true legacy of Dumbledore, not the victories he claimed, but the souls he shaped, wounded, and ultimately left stronger than they were before. In the end, Harry and Snape were united by their pain, by the weight of Dumbledore's expectations, and by the knowledge that they had both been used. But they had also both been chosen to bear burdens others could not, chosen to make decisions others would flee, chosen to protect a world that did not understand them. And through that pain they found purpose, not because of Dumbledore, but in spite of him. Number 19, both remained misunderstood. There was a boy who lived, and there was a man who died. One was lifted onto the shoulders of a grateful world, hailed as a hero, adorned with medals in silence. The other was buried without applause, remembered by many as a villain, whispered about in corridors, still echoing with fear. But between them lay a bridge, few noticed, built not of affection, but of shared silence, invisible wounds, and truths too heavy to say aloud. Harry Potter was the name that rang through the streets, a name etched on chocolate frog cards and children's textbooks. People saw his scar and thought of courage, saw his name and thought of triumph, but they never stopped to look into his eyes. They never saw the hollowness that lingered after the last Horcrux was destroyed. After the Battle of Hogwarts, when the rubble settled and the war was won, everyone assumed the boy who lived had found peace. But Harry never truly found peace. He found duty, he found expectations, he found people needing hope. He gave them all of that. What he never gave them, because no one ever asked, was the truth of what he had lost. And then there was Severus Snape, the man who lived behind the curtain of suspicion, wrapped in black robes and bitterness, armed with sarcasm like a shield. To most, he was the teacher who delighted in cruelty, the man who tormented Neville Longbottom with threats and insults, the professor who made Hermione Granger cry over a botched potion. In life, he was feared. In death, he was misunderstood. Only a few saw the truth that lived in the shadows, truths uncovered not by adoration, but by a desperate boy diving into a vial of memories moments after the man's life had drained out beside the shrieking shack. What united them, Harry and Severus, was not love. It wasn't friendship or admiration or even respect. It was loneliness, it was pain, it was the knowledge that no one would ever really understand what they had carried. Both bore burdens they never asked for. Harry carried the weight of prophecy, Snape the weight of guilt. Neither of them chose to be what they became, and both, in different ways, lost their childhoods to a war that demanded everything. When Harry walked back into the Great Hall, stepping over bodies and soaked stone, he did not cry. He comforted others, spoke to the bereaved, answered questions. But that night, as he sat in the remains of Dumbledore's office, he stared at Fawkes's empty perch and remembered the feel of Snape's blood on his hands. Not because he had loved Snape, he hadn't, but because he had understood him too late. "Look at me," Snape had said, and only later did Harry realize what he was being asked to see. Not the sneer, not the darkness, but Lily's eyes. Snape, in turn, had watched Harry for years with a hatred that confused even himself. He had seen James in the boy's face and scorned him, but he had also seen Lily, her eyes, her defiance, her compassion, and tried not to care. But he did care. That's why he protected him, why he stood between him and death again and again. In the prince's tale, as the memories poured from Snape's mind, the truth emerged like morning mist. Always, he had said to Dumbledore, and in that one word lived a lifetime of silent sacrifice. They were two sides of a mirror. Harry, the public hero with private wounds. Snape, the private hero with a public curse. And neither of them had anyone to talk to about it. Ron Weasley, for all his loyalty, never fully understood Harry's silence. Hermione tried, but even she didn't know what it meant to carry the deaths of Lupin, Tonks, Fred, and so many others. No one knew what it meant to walk into the Forbidden Forest ready to die and come back into a world expecting you to smile. Snape had no friends, only memories. His love for Lily Evans was the one soft thing he ever allowed himself, and even that had been scorched by her death. He had no grave marked by flowers, no family to mourn him. Even in the end, when Harry stood before his portrait in the headmaster's office, there were those who still scoffed at the mention of Severus Snape. He bullied students, they said. He was cruel. And Harry would nod, because it was true. But then he would say, "He was the bravest man I ever knew." Albus Severus Potter was not just a name. It was a confession. It was an apology. Harry named his son after the man who had loved in secret, suffered in silence, and died without fanfare. It was a way to say, "I see you now. I see what you did." The naming wasn't for the world. It was for the man in the shadows whose memory lived in whispers and stone. Snape, too, carried his grief like armor. When he looked at Harry, he didn't just see James, he saw what might have been. A child that could have been his, had the world been different, had choices been made otherwise. He hated Harry for not being hers entirely, and loved him for being hers in part. That's why he saved him. That's why he risked everything to deliver false information to Voldemort, to shield Harry from the prophecies. Wait, even as he cursed Dumbledore's name in secret. Both men were marked by sacrifice. Harry lost his innocence, his childhood, and nearly his life for a world that would never understand. Snape gave up his soul, his identity, and finally his life for a boy he could barely stand to look at. They didn't want praise, they wanted peace. But peace never came easily for either of them. When Harry visited Hogwarts years later as an Auror and war veteran, he often paused outside the potions classroom. Sometimes he'd glance at the dungeon door, half expecting the voice of Professor Snape to cut the silence with a drawl. But what lived in Harry's mind was not the scorn, but the silence that followed it, the quiet acts of protection, the unspoken care. During the final duel, when Harry faced Voldemort in the Great Hall, he referenced the protection that Snape had unknowingly passed to him. "Snape was never yours," he told the Dark Lord. "He was Dumbledore's." But even that wasn't entirely true. Snape wasn't anyone's, he was his own, always balancing on a tightrope between darkness and duty. His love for Lily was his light, and it burned him until the end. Harry understood that kind of burn. He too had loved people he could not save. He had watched Cedric Diggory die because he wasn't fast enough. He had watched Sirius Black fall through the veil because he had believed in hope. He had watched Dobby die in his arms with no magic strong enough to stop it. Like Snape, Harry had learned that love often ended in loss. And like Snape, he kept loving anyway. They were never friends, but they were allies in suffering. Each bore a scar the world couldn't see. For Harry, it was the weight of survival. For Snape, the weight of regret. And both had become something they never intended, legends, not by choice, but by necessity. When students whispered about Snape in later years, they remembered the scowl, the detentions, the biting sarcasm, but some remembered more. They remembered the stories told in hushed tones, the truth that slowly leaked out, that Snape was a double agent, that he saved Harry's life, that he died protecting the son of the woman he had always loved. The truth grew like a flower through cracks in stone, fragile but impossible to ignore. Harry, too, was changed. He smiled more in public than he did in private. He gave speeches at memorials, opened a department for magical trauma recovery, and comforted the children of fallen fighters. But sometimes at night, he would sit alone with a photo of the original order, looking at faces long gone. He never stopped wondering if it had all been worth it. Snape's face wasn't in those pictures, but it lived in Harry's memory, sharper than any photograph. They were both shaped by a war that took too much and returned too little. And in the end, both of them understood that heroism didn't mean being liked. It meant doing the right thing when no one would thank you. It meant standing alone. It meant being misunderstood. Snape never asked for forgiveness. He never said he was sorry. He let his actions speak. And Harry listened, too late perhaps, but he listened. He took that knowledge and passed it on, not through sermons, but through remembrance. The portrait in the headmaster's office, the naming of a son, the silence he kept when others criticized Snape, these were Harry's ways of saying, "You mattered." And maybe that's all either of them ever really wanted. To matter. Not to the world, but to someone who understood. For a fleeting moment they did understand each other. A dying man looking into the eyes of a boy, and a boy later placing a name upon a child. Neither gesture erased the pain, but it acknowledged it. The world will always remember Harry Potter as the boy who lived. Few will remember that he never wanted to be. The world will always remember Severus Snape as the man who taught potions with cruelty. Few will remember that he taught Harry to live, but those few, those who remember both the cost and the courage, will see the truth, that heroism is not about being loved, it's about being brave in the face of silence, and sometimes it's about loving what the world has already lost. Number 20, magic was pain, not pride. Harry Potter's instinctive defiance of authority was not rooted in rebellion for its own sake, but in a deeply embedded compass of right and wrong. Time and time again he put himself in jeopardy not to prove a point or to earn praise, but to protect those who could not defend themselves. When he stormed into Umbridge's office to contact the Order, it wasn't arrogance, it was desperation to save Sirius. When he freed Dobby from Lucius Malfoy, it wasn't strategy, it was justice. Even in the earliest years at Hogwarts, Harry's heart responded like a litmus test to injustice. Whether it was Neville Longbottom standing up to his friends or the undeserved punishment of Hagrid, Harry reacted instinctively, passionately, with a conviction that rules meant little if they perpetuated cruelty. This moral fibre, raw and unpolished, echoes more subtly in Severus Snape, whose life was a complex tapestry of bitterness, sacrifice, and unspoken ethics. At first glance, Snape was everything Harry was not: sarcastic, biased, cruel in demeanour. Yet buried beneath layers of pain and resentment was a man whose every choice was an act of protection. While Harry challenged injustice with passion, Snape did it with silence. But their motivations aligned more closely than either of them realized. Snape's life, too, was defined by an intimate knowledge of cruelty and a determination to defy it, even at the cost of his own happiness. When Harry faced the trial of Buckbeak, the hippogriff unjustly sentenced to death, he didn't simply stand aside and mourn, he took action. Along with Hermione and Ron, he devised a plan to save the creature. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, the line, "We're not just going to let Buckbeak die," is more than adolescent stubbornness. It is the birth of Harry's moral autonomy. He refuses to let protocol overrule compassion. This decision, while not legally sanctioned, reveals the heart of who Harry is, someone willing to break rules to uphold a higher code of justice. Snape, too, showed a fierce resistance to injustice, but his methods were cloaked in secrecy. The most potent example lies in his unwavering commitment to protect Harry, the very boy who bore the face of someone he loathed. Dumbledore once said, "You are a braver man by far than Igor Karkaroff. You know what it means to serve the Dark Lord, and you know the cost." Snape's decision to double-cross Voldemort, to inform Dumbledore of the prophecy, and to agree to protect Harry was not born out of obligation. It was penance, but it was also justice. He recognized that Lily's death was a consequence of his own entanglement with darkness. In defending her son, he was restoring balance, silently, painfully. Harry's sense of justice was often personal. He couldn't endure the abuse of others, especially when it echoed his own trauma. His outrage at the treatment of house elves was sparked by Hermione's campaign, but it resonated because Harry knew what it meant to be invisible and dismissed. In The Goblet of Fire, when Winky is dismissed, Harry is visibly uncomfortable. "You can't treat her like that," he says. But it's not just about Winky. It's about the part of Harry that still remembers the cupboard under the stairs. He sees injustice not abstractly, but in the echoes of his own suffering. Snape's justice was less emotional, more strategic, but no less fierce. His relationship with Draco Malfoy in The Half-Blood Prince is often misunderstood. While others saw favoritism, Snape saw a child on the edge of ruin. Dumbledore entrusted Snape with the impossible, to protect Draco from the consequences of the task Voldemort had assigned him. In doing so, Snape made an unbreakable vow. When he eventually killed Dumbledore, it was not an act of murder, but a final excruciating gift of protection, for Draco, for Harry, for the fragile balance of good still lingering in a war-torn world. Neither Harry nor Snape was content to be a passive participant in a flawed system. The Ministry's corruption, the arbitrary cruelty of Hogwarts rules, even Dumbledore's calculated manipulations, both of them chafed under such authority. In the Order of the Phoenix, Harry is outraged that no one believes Voldemort has returned. His confrontation with the Ministry is not about glory, it's about truth. He says, "You're the one who's weak. You will never know love or friendship." His challenge is rooted not in pride, but in moral certainty. Snape's own rebellion was quieter. He disdained the politics of the Death Eaters, yet he infiltrated them. He loathed the elitism of Hogwarts, yet he became its gatekeeper. His entire life became an act of espionage, not for thrill, but for justice. He could not undo the past, but he could reshape the future by quietly correcting the course. Every potion he brewed, every occlumency lesson he gave, every lie he told Voldemort was part of a larger war, a war not just for survival but for redemption. Harry and Snape were both orphans of injustice. Harry's loss was visible, parents murdered, childhood stolen, identity hidden. Snape's loss was internal, a broken home, unrequited love, a life warped by decisions made in desperation. Both knew what it meant to suffer unfairly, and both, in their own way, vowed not to let it happen to others. When Harry watched Cedric die, his sense of justice sharpened. No longer was it about school rules or magical creatures, it became a matter of life and death. Cedric's murder and the Ministry's attempt to erase it was a turning point. Harry's refusal to be silent, to pretend it hadn't happened, was the act of a boy growing into a man. He was murdered, Harry tells Dumbledore, and Voldemort did it. This was more than grief, it was moral. Resistance. Snape's greatest act of justice, however, remained unseen until after his death. The memory he gave Harry, those fragments of truth, became the key to Voldemort's downfall. It was Snape's knowledge that revealed the true nature of the Elder Wand, that exposed Harry's connection to the Dark Lord. In The Prince's Tale, the words, "Look at me," spoken as he lay dying, are not random. They are the plea of a man whose life had been one long, painful mission of quiet righteousness. And finally, in Harry's eyes, he saw understanding. Both men despised cruelty in their own way. Harry reacted emotionally, impulsively. He rushed to save Sirius, to warn the DA, to defend Luna from ridicule. He hated seeing others mocked or tormented, and it made him act. Snape, in contrast, wore the mask of cruelty to protect those he cared about. He insulted Harry, but saved his life. He belittled Neville, but kept him alive. Even his treatment of Hermione, though harsh, was part of a protective wall, keeping her at a distance so she wouldn't be targeted. Justice for Harry was about defending the innocent. Justice for Snape was about preserving what little innocence remained. And though their methods were worlds apart, their goal was shared. When Harry named his son Albus Severus, he didn't do so out of sentimentality. He did so because he finally understood. He was the bravest man I ever knew, not because Snape was kind, but because Snape was just. In The Deathly Hallows, when Harry walks willingly into the forest to die, he echoes Snape's sacrifice. He knows that some acts of justice come without reward. He gives himself freely, not for glory, but to save others. It is the culmination of his moral journey, the ultimate stand against injustice, not with a wand, but with a heart willing to break for others. Snape had walked that same path decades before. When he agreed to spy on Voldemort, he knew it would cost him everything: his reputation, his safety, his soul. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he didn't seek applause, he simply did what had to be done. Like Harry, he accepted that justice sometimes means losing. The tragedy of their parallel paths is that they never recognized each other's cause in life. Snape saw James in Harry's arrogance, and Harry saw hatred in Snape's coldness. But beneath those misconceptions lay two souls bound by a sacred vow to never let cruelty go unchallenged, to shield the vulnerable, to fight, not for themselves, but for what was right. And so they remain in the minds of readers as two sides of the same coin, one loud, the other silent, one praised, the other misunderstood, but both fierce in their defense of justice, both warriors of conscience, both haunted by injustice, and both in their own way determined to end its reign. Number 21, they never wanted public glory. When the war ended and the echo of Voldemort's final scream faded into silence, Harry Potter did not stand above the ruins like a crowned king. He did not gather the broken wands of fallen Death Eaters to raise them in triumph. He did not pose for portraits or wave to crowds. He did not even linger in the great hall to soak in the stunned reverence of those who had watched him cast the final spell. Instead, he walked away. Quietly, without fanfare, without a crown, without asking for anything. The boy who lived had finally become the boy who left. He wanted no statues, no songs, and certainly no spotlight. He simply wanted to breathe again, to be someone else, someone unknown. There was a moment, recorded in the aftermath of the Battle of Hogwarts, when Kingsley Shacklebolt offered Harry a chance to speak at a public memorial. He declined. Not rudely, not with anger, but with a tired shake of the head. The newspapers would write of his courage, of course. They would fill pages with praise, with exclamations and metaphors, but Harry himself never read those stories. He didn't collect them, he didn't frame them, he didn't quote them. He found their adoration suffocating. "It's not about me," he said once to Hermione. Quietly, when she caught him staring out a window instead of celebrating, "I just want it to be over." That line never made it into the Daily Prophet. There is a deep irony in this, for the boy who had once craved belonging now recoiled from the very thing that offered it. In his youth, Harry had longed to be part of a family, to be noticed, to be seen. But by the end of the war, he understood the cost of being seen. The public made you into a symbol, a myth, a flawless statue. They took away your humanity and replaced it with marble. Harry didn't want to be a statue. He wanted to feel, to cry, to break and rebuild himself, away from watchful eyes. Fame had been thrust upon him as a baby. As a man, he finally had a choice. He chose silence. And in that silence, he resembled someone he had once hated, and someone he had misjudged, ridiculed, and misunderstood. Severus Snape had spent a lifetime doing what was necessary, never what was admirable. He worked in shadows, surrounded by suspicion and disgust. He carried burdens so heavy that even Dumbledore faltered under their weight. Yet never once did Snape correct the record. Never once did he ask to be thanked. Never once did he look up when people spat his name like poison. Snape's legacy was soaked in bitterness, but it was by design. He had no interest in explaining himself. When Harry finally glimpsed the memories behind those cold black eyes, he saw a man who had orchestrated redemption through pain, not applause. Snape loved a woman who died. He protected her son with a ferocity that required everyone to hate him. He aligned himself with monsters to defeat a greater one, and when he died, the world still thought him a traitor. He never wrote a confession. He never left a letter. He died the way he lived, misunderstood and alone. "Look at me," he had said, his last breath a whisper meant only for Harry. It was not a plea for glory. It was not a request for his name to be cleared. It was a final act of love, deeply private and personal. Even in death, Snape refused to open his soul to the world. His truth belonged only to one person. And that person understood there's a curious kinship in that, between a boy who didn't want to be praised and a man who didn't want to be forgiven. Between someone who turned away from crowds and someone who walked straight into hatred. Both bore the weight of the wizarding world. Both played roles they did not choose. Both shaped history and then vanished from its center. It is tempting to compare them through their differences. House colors, tempers, childhoods. But their deepest link is invisible, stitched together by quiet rejection of public worship. James Potter, by contrast, never shied away from attention. He was loud, bright, magnetic. People loved him because he invited their love. He thrived in company, commanded admiration, and never doubted his place in the center. He was head boy, Quidditch captain, prankster king. His life was a constant performance, and he loved every minute of it. Harry, his son, grew to admire that spirit, but not to emulate it. There was too much weight in his past, too many ghosts. And Snape? Snape hated James, not just because of Lily, though that was part of it. He hated the way James absorbed attention so easily, the way crowds followed him, the way he laughed like nothing could ever hurt him. Snape had been invisible for too long, and when he was visible, it was always for the wrong reasons. Greasy hair, hooked nose, cold stare. He was made monstrous by teenage cruelty, and he let that mask calcify over time. He did not seek to change it. Harry, in his own way, rejected both templates. He would not be James, basking in attention, but he would not be Snape, snarling in corners. He carved out a third path, anonymity with purpose. He became an aura, not for medals, but for peace. He married Ginny not for headlines, but for home. He named his son after the man who had saved him without asking for thanks. Albus Severus, he said, you were named for 2 headmasters of Hogwarts. One of them was a Slytherin, and he was probably the bravest man I ever knew. That was his tribute. Simple. Quiet. Enough. There was never a monument to Snape in the Ministry of Magic. No stained glass window in the Great Hall. No epic ballad sung by the Weird Sisters. Just a memory passed from Harry to his children. That was all. And yet it was more honest than any public memorial, because Snape never wanted to be a symbol. Symbols lie. Snape preferred truth, however painful. He preferred silence, however isolating. His courage lived in shadows, just like Harry's peace. What ties them most is their aversion to being defined by others. Both were shaped by loss. Harry by the loss of his parents, Snape by the loss of Lily. Both wore masks, Harry as the chosen one, Snape as the villain. And both spent years trying to escape those masks. Recognition for them was not a reward, but a trap. To be celebrated was to be caged. To be understood too publicly was to be distorted. There is a moment after the final battle when Harry uses the Elder Wand to repair his own. And then he breaks the Elder Wand, the most powerful wand in existence, the symbol of mastery, of dominance, of mythic status. Harry breaks it and throws it away. That gesture, silent, without speech or witness, says everything. He does not want power. He does not want fame. He wants his own life back. That's all. Snape made a similar gesture, though subtler, every time he insulted a student instead of protecting them with kindness, every time he snapped at Harry instead of showing care, every time he chose to be hated instead of explaining his role. These were not acts of cruelty, though they seemed like it. They were shields. Deliberate, strategic, painful, necessary. Snape knew that to be effective, he had to be feared and never questioned. Even Dumbledore recognized this trait in both. He once said, "You are a much better man than I, Harry." But perhaps he was also admitting that both Harry and Snape carried a kind of moral clarity he lacked, the clarity to act without needing reward. Dumbledore played games, Snape played roles, Harry played neither. He simply acted and walked away. That's where his resemblance to Snape blooms most brightly. The night Harry left the wizarding world behind, even for a little while, he didn't throw a party. He didn't announce it. He just disappeared. No one saw him for weeks. He needed space, needed stillness. He had learned from Snape that some truths are too sacred to be shared, that some wounds are healed not by applause but by solitude, that real heroism is not loud. When he returned, he refused interviews again. Rita Skeeter tried. Others tried. He answered nothing. He smiled politely and walked away, like Snape used to do, a quiet shadow in the background of larger stories. But now the shadow had found peace. Because for Harry, being unknown was not a curse. It was a gift, one that Snape had never been granted in life, but which Harry now held tightly in honor of both of them. And perhaps that is the final link between them. Both were misunderstood, one while living, the other while victorious. But where the world failed Snape in his lifetime, Harry chose to succeed, where others hadn't. He understood, and understanding is the highest form of love. He could not rewrite Snape's history, but he could carry it, quietly, gratefully, without needing anyone else to clap. Number 22, Voldemort was their true enemy. Harry Potter and Severus Snape were never meant to be allies. Their story was paved with resentment, misunderstanding, and the heavy shadows of the past. One was the son of the man who had humiliated the other. The other was the teacher who seemed to loathe the boy from the moment they met. But beneath the layers of animosity lay a truth that time would reveal only at the cost of immense pain. They were united by a hatred deeper than their mutual distaste. They both hated Lord Voldemort, not for the same reasons, but with a fury that burned as hot on both sides. That hatred wasn't about ideology, it wasn't about power, politics, or personal gain. It was personal, forged in grief, guilt, and the ruins of love. For Harry, the hatred began in a crib. He never got to know his parents. Their images lived in photographs that moved and smiled, in memories others offered like gifts he couldn't keep. He grew up in a cupboard under the stairs, underfed and unloved, and all of it because of one man. Voldemort had murdered James and Lily Potter and left Harry an orphan. The scar on his forehead was a reminder not only of the curse that failed to kill him, but of the childhood stolen from him. Harry's hate was not born of abstract loss. It was the daily emptiness where a mother's hug should have been, the silence where a father's laughter was meant to be. Severus Snape's hatred, though, was more complex. Voldemort had never raised a wand against Snape. On the contrary, he had accepted him, given him status, allowed him to stand in the inner circle. But Voldemort had taken the only thing Snape had ever truly loved, Lily Evans. Snape's hatred was the hatred of a man who betrayed himself. He had chosen the wrong side. He had uttered the word mudblood to the girl who was everything to him. He had begged the Dark Lord to spare her, but Voldemort was never a man of mercy. Lily died anyway, and Snape's world cracked. As Dumbledore later observed with quiet disdain, "You disgust me." Snape had joined the Order not out of loyalty to Dumbledore, not for the good of the world, but because he could not live with what he had done. Harry never knew that. Not until the end. Until then, he had seen Snape only as the cruel potions master, who mocked him, deducted points from Gryffindor for breathing, and made his school days a minefield of humiliation. But even through that haze of enmity, there were glimpses, tiny cracks in Snape's armor that hinted at something more. When Snape saved Harry from Quirrell in his first year, there was no explanation, no reward, just a flash of a hand and a muttered countercurse. When Dumbledore died and Snape fled the castle, Harry's scream, "Coward!" ripped through the night. But the truth was more brutal than Harry could ever have guessed. It was in the pensive that the veil lifted. Snape's memories showed a broken man kneeling before Dumbledore, asking for a child's life to be protected. "Hide her! Hide them all! Keep her! Keep them safe!" The same man had watched over Harry, not because he liked him, but because he loved the boy's mother. Everything Snape did, the occlumency lessons, the protection from the shadows, the acts of apparent betrayal, all were guided by a secret promise. He had devoted his life to a cause he barely believed in, just to honor the woman who had once defended him on a playground. And yet, Snape's hatred of Voldemort went beyond Lily. Voldemort had turned Snape into a tool, a pawn that moved in silence, bearing witness to the cruelty of both sides. Snape saw the Dark Lord for what he was, not a visionary, not a leader, but a parasite who used people's pain to bind them to him. He watched young witches and wizards join the Death Eaters and vanish into darkness. He watched Hogwarts fall under the control of Carrows who tortured students. Snape's hatred was the loathing of a man who once believed in power and saw it rot everything it touched. Harry's own journey mirrored that revelation. At first, Voldemort was the monster under the bed, the name that silenced rooms. But over the years, Harry saw what Voldemort left behind. Cedric Diggory killed for being in the way, Sirius Black lost in a cruel game of possession, Dobby struck down while saving lives, Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks casualties of a war Voldemort stoked and prolonged. Each name was a new wound. Each face a reminder that Voldemort's hatred for humanity had no bottom. As Harry stood in the graveyard during the Triwizard Tournament, staring at the reborn form of his enemy, he realized that this was not just about revenge. It was about stopping something that devoured everything it touched. Both Snape and Harry had the chance to walk away. Snape could have stayed hidden, claimed neutrality, disappeared into the shadows. Harry, offered the comfort of the Burrow and the love of the Weasleys, could have tried to forget the scar, let someone else take up the fight. But they didn't. They couldn't, because Voldemort hadn't just hurt them. He had altered the course of their lives. He had made them into weapons, and they chose to point those weapons back at him. The irony was that both were alone in their hatred. Harry had friends, yes, but no one truly understood what it meant to carry Voldemort inside, to feel his thoughts, to dream his dreams. Snape, surrounded by Death Eaters, lived a double life, always one slip away from death. Their hatred was a solitary burden, burning quietly behind their eyes, and it made them more alike than either would ever admit. In The Prince's Tale, the line that shattered Harry's perception of Snape forever was simple: always. That single word whispered over Lily's memory was not just about love, it was about pain that never healed. Snape's hatred of Voldemort was not born of noble ideals. It was born of the realization that he had given his soul to a man who cared nothing for it. And so he turned that hatred into action, sacrificing everything to bring Voldemort down, even if history would never thank him. Harry, too, learned the cost of that kind of hate. In the Forbidden Forest, facing death with the Resurrection Stone in hand, he realized that to defeat Voldemort he had to die, not just pretend, really to die, because Voldemort had tethered part of his soul to Harry's. In that moment, Harry's hatred transformed. It became an act of love. He gave up his life not for revenge, but for peace, for a world where children wouldn't grow up in fear, where no one would lose a mother to a curse. It is in that moment that Harry and Snape finally walk the same path. Both had been broken by Voldemort. Both had lost everything to him. And both had made the same decision, to keep going, to fight, not because they expected glory, but because something inside them refused to let the darkness win. The books often present Harry as the boy who lived, but Snape was the man who died every day, died to his reputation, to his dignity, to his dreams. He died a little more every time he looked into Harry's eyes and saw Lily's, yet he never stopped, because hatred alone wouldn't have sustained him. Underneath it was a desperate hope that one day the Dark Lord would fall and something better would grow in the ashes. Dumbledore once told Harry that, "Do not pity the dead, Harry, pity the living, and above all those who live without love." Snape had lived without love since Lily's death, but in the end he gave the world a gift it didn't deserve, the truth, that a Slytherin could be brave, that hatred could be transformed into sacrifice, that even a Death Eater could become a savior. The final irony is that Voldemort never understood either of them. He saw Snape as a tool, Harry as a threat, but never grasped the depth of their resistance. He believed in fear, control, and dominance. But Harry and Snape were driven by memories, by ghosts that whispered truths Voldemort couldn't kill. In trying to break them, he only made them stronger. Harry buried Snape without applause. No statue was raised, no celebration held. But he named his son Albus Severus, saying, "He was the bravest man I ever knew." That sentence contains the entire arc of their shared hatred. What began in anger ended in understanding. What was once loathing became legacy. Hatred, when it is pure, can destroy. But when it is forged in love, it becomes something else. It becomes the will to protect, to remember, to stand when no one else will. Harry and Snape hated Voldemort not because he was evil, but because he made them face who they truly were. And they chose to fight, to love, to lose, rather than become like him. That is what united them. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but a silent, burning truth. Voldemort destroyed their lives, and in return they gave him everything they had left, until he had nothing at all. Number 23, they became what they never wanted to be. Harry Potter never dreamed of being a hero. When he first arrived at Hogwarts, he craved only what had been stolen from him, a family, safety, and the freedom to just be a boy. His thoughts lingered on classes and friendships, on discovering magic and playing Quidditch. He marvelled at Bertie Bott's every flavour beans and the Forbidden Forest. He wanted to learn, to laugh, to belong. But instead of a peaceful childhood, Harry became a weapon. He became the chosen one, a living prophecy, moulded not by his own ambitions but by the expectations of a world that never asked what he wanted. He never asked to be the one to face Voldemort, yet he walked willingly toward death. I must die, he thought in the Deathly Hallows, and Voldemort himself must do it. That was the task he had been prepared for. This wasn't the dream of an 11-year-old boy who saw a magical castle across the lake. This was a burden carried by someone who never had a chance to choose anything else. Severus Snape, too, was forged by longing, not for glory or power, but for love. As a child, he watched the world from the shadows, growing up unloved in a house full of shouting and cold silence. Then came Lily Evans. She was sunlight to him, a spark of warmth in a world that never offered him comfort. He dreamed not of being head of Slytherin or the Dark Lord's spy, but of sitting beside her in a world where he was seen, understood, and needed. His Patronus, a silver doe, was the echo of that dream. After all this time? Dumbledore asked. Always, Snape answered. He didn't become Lily's partner. He became the bitter man who watched her marry James Potter. He became the professor everyone feared, the traitor both sides suspected, the double agent who bore the hate of the world so Harry could live. Neither of them wanted what they became. Harry wanted simplicity. Snape wanted love. But the war against Voldemort demanded sacrifices, and both of them paid with their identity. Harry grew into the role of a symbol, not because he desired it, but because others placed that weight on his shoulders. His name was whispered with awe before he understood what it meant. People stared at the scar on his forehead as though it marked him wholly. The boy who lived was never a title he asked for. He didn't want to be the figure in the papers, the subject of endless rumors, the final hope of a desperate resistance. But he couldn't ignore the pain around him, so he stood when others fell. He faced graveyards and basilisks, dementors and prophecy, until he no longer remembered what normal felt like. Snape never desired to be feared. His younger self was awkward, bookish, desperate for friendship. But his bitterness grew, watered by rejection and humiliation. His time at Hogwarts didn't offer salvation. It deepened his loneliness. The marauder's cruelty left scars that never healed, and in the process of seeking protection through power, he chose the wrong path. He became a Death Eater, thinking it would elevate him, not realizing it would sever him from the only soul that ever truly mattered to him. When Lily died, his dream shattered completely. He didn't become the man he hoped Lily would love. He became the man who stood in shadows, ensuring her son would survive, though the boy bore the face of her husband. Harry never wanted to lead. During the formation of Dumbledore's army, he hesitated, unsure why others looked to him, but he taught them because he couldn't bear to see more pain. He stepped into leadership not out of hunger for it, but because silence was no longer an option. He watched Cedric die, Sirius fall through the veil, Dumbledore tumble from the astronomy tower. With each death he changed, losing the boy who once looked forward to butterbeer and snowball fights. He never truly became what the wizarding world called him. He was never comfortable with praise or glory. Even after Voldemort fell, Harry disappeared from the spotlight, retreating into a quiet life, as if trying to reclaim the peace he had never known. Snape became the mask. At first, it was necessary. He had to deceive Voldemort. He had to maintain the role of trusted servant. But over time, the mask fused with his skin. He snarled in class, ridiculed students, and pushed others away, not because he hated them, but because closeness was dangerous. He couldn't afford weakness. Every day he walked into the Great Hall, students whispered behind his back, and he let them. The world saw a cruel man in black, but behind that mask was someone who carried unbearable grief, a man who risked everything and asked for nothing. He became a villain in the eyes of many, just so he could protect the son of the woman he once loved. Harry and Snape were bound by shared silence. They never spoke openly about their burdens. Their relationship was built on mistrust and hostility, but both of them were playing roles written by others. In the end, Snape gave Harry the memories that told the real story, not just of love, but of duty. Those memories revealed that Snape's hatred of James was real, but his protection of Harry was stronger. Harry, seeing the truth, wept not for the spy, but for the man who had lost everything. He named his second son Albus Severus, saying, "You were named after 2 headmasters of Hogwarts. One of them was a Slytherin, and he was probably the bravest man I ever knew." It was a final act of recognition from one soldier to another. James Potter had been the golden boy. He was talented, bold, popular. He was who he wanted to be. He pursued Lily, won her heart, fought the war, and died a hero. There was no tragedy in his arc, only valor. But Harry wasn't his father. His path was laced with sacrifice, not triumph. And Snape, though brilliant and powerful, was never admired the way James was. He didn't die in glory. He died alone in the shrieking shack, unloved and unthanked, until Harry glimpsed the truth. While James was remembered with warmth, Snape was remembered with fear. Only one boy understood what he had truly done. Harry's childhood was stolen by prophecy. Snape's humanity was buried under layers of regret. Both men bore the weight of choices made for them. The difference between them and those who broke was that they didn't walk away. When Dumbledore asked Snape to protect Harry, Snape didn't hesitate, even though the boy was the embodiment of his worst pain. When Voldemort returned and everyone doubted him, Harry kept fighting, even though it cost him everything. Neither man was rewarded, neither was celebrated, but both endured. It's easy to see heroes in armor and villains in cloaks. It's harder to see the ones who wore neither. Harry never wore the gleaming robes of a hero. Snape never embraced the theatrics of villainy. They both operated in the grey. Harry's sacrifices weren't always seen. Snape's intentions were never explained. But in that ambiguity, they became something greater than characters. They became people. People who didn't ask for greatness, but responded to its call. In The Half-Blood Prince, when Harry uses Snape's own spell, Sectum Sempra, he sees the danger of knowledge without understanding. The book itself, marked Property of the Half-Blood Prince, is a metaphor for Snape's life, brilliant, dark, and misinterpreted. Harry hated Snape, then envied him, then finally understood him. That journey mirrored his own evolution, from boy to warrior, from innocence to burdened maturity. Snape, in turn, never stopped seeing James in Harry. It blinded him to Harry's goodness for years, but in the end, it didn't matter. He didn't save Harry because he liked him. He saved him because it was right. Because Lily's eyes looked back at him through the face of a boy who reminded him of everything he lost. "Look at me," he whispered with his last breath. Not to be remembered, but to see her one last time. That moment was all he had left. Harry never truly forgave the world for what it took from him. Even after peace returned, he remained quiet, almost haunted. He did not build monuments or revel in fame. He lived. He married, he raised children, he kept his promises, but the boy who once dreamed of Quidditch and Hogsmeade weekends was gone. In his place stood a man who had walked through death and returned, not as a hero, but as a survivor. Snape never found redemption in life. He found it only in memory. After death, his story unfolded in pieces, through vials of memory, through Harry's words, through small acts finally revealed. He never saw Lily again, never stood in the sun. His reward was silence, but he, like Harry, did what he had to do. He didn't run, he didn't abandon his role even when it burned him alive. Both of them became what the world needed, not what they wanted. Harry became a soldier, Snape became a martyr. They bore the weight of other people's wars and never asked for thanks. They didn't choose their paths, but they walked them with clenched fists and broken hearts. In the end, they were not opposites. They were reflections, mirrors, warped by pain, shaped by sacrifice. And when the world moved on, when Hogwarts reopened and children laughed again, Harry remembered. He remembered the boy who wanted to belong and the man who chose pain for love. And in the quiet, in the unmarked grave, and the name whispered to his son, Severus Snape lived on. Not as a villain, not even as a hero, but as someone who, like Harry, became what the world demanded, because someone had to,